Welcome to Eco 101, Study Session 3, Introduction to Market Mechanism, Demand and Supply. Introduction. In this study session, you will explore how market allocates goods and services with remarkable efficiency. You will also see why market functions so smoothly most of the time and why bureaucratic rules and regulations rarely work in solving complex economic problems. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Outline the basic principles of demand. 2. Construct supply curve. 3. Determine market equilibrium price and quantity. 4. Differentiate between changes in demand and quantity demanded. Making economic decisions. Central planning versus market. There is no society, irrespective of how it is organized, that can escape the need to answer certain basic economic questions. For example, how much of our limited time and other resources should we devote to building housing? How much to the production of food? Who should be assigned to each specific task? And how should the resulting goods and services be distributed among people? In many societies, issues like these have been decided in essentially one of two ways. One approach is for all economic decisions to be made centrally by an individual or small number of individuals on behalf of a larger group. For example, the economic organization of the former Soviet Union and other communist countries was largely centralized. In centrally planned communist nations, a central bureaucratic committee established production targets for the country's farm and factories, develops a master plan for how to achieve the targets, including detailed instructions concerning who should produce what, and set up guidelines for the distribution and the use of goods and services produced. At the beginning of the 21st century, many societies employed the second major form of economic system, free market economy, one in which production and distribution decisions are left to individuals interacting in private markets. In the so-called free market or capitalist economies, people decide for themselves which career to pursue and which products to produce or buy. There are, however, no pure free market economies today. Modern industrial countries are more properly described as mixed economies, meaning that goods and services are allocated by a combination of free markets, regulations, and other forms of collective control. Markets have replaced centralized control in many countries for the simple reason that they tend to assign production tax and consumption benefits much more effectively. There is an overwhelming agreement among economists about a broad range of issues, with the great majority accepting the efficacy of markets as means for allocating society's scarce resources. The demand curve. The demand curve is a simple schedule or graph that shows the amount of a given good people are willing to buy at different prices. Invariably, this is a graph of quantity demanded at varying prices. By convention, economics usually put price on the vertical axis of the demand curve and quantity on the horizontal axis. A fundamental property of the demand curve is that it is downward sloping with respect to price. For example, the demand curve for bread tells us that as the price of bread falls, buyers will buy more. This is depicted in figure 3.1. The demand curve in figure 3.1 shows that when the price of bread is low, say 2 naira, buyers will want to buy 16,000 loaves of bread, whereas they will want to buy only 12,000 loaves at the price of 3 naira and only 8,000 loaves at a price of 4 naira. The demand curve for bread and any other good is downward sloping for multiple reasons. Some of the reasons have to do with the individual's consumer's reaction to price changes. Thus, as bread becomes more expensive, a consumer may switch to gari or other foods that substitute for bread. This is called substitution effect of a price change. In addition, a price increase reduces the quantity demanded because it reduces purchasing power. A consumer simply cannot afford to buy as many loaves of bread at higher prices as at lower prices. This is called the income effect of a price change. Another reason that the demand curve slopes downward is that consumers differ in terms of how much they are willing to pay for the good. The cost-benefit analysis tells us that an individual will buy the good if the benefit he expects to receive from it exceeds cost. The benefit is the buyer's reservation price, the highest naira amount he would be willing to pay for the good. The cost of the good is the actual amount the buyer actually must pay, which is the market price of the good. In most markets, different buyers have different reservation prices. Thus, when the good sells for a high price, it will satisfy the cost-benefit test for few buyers than when it sells for a lower price. In another way, the fact that the demand curve for a good is downward sloping reflects the fact that the reservation price of the marginal buyer declines as the quantity of the good bought increases. Here, the marginal buyer is the person who purchases the last unit of the good that is sold. If buyers are currently buying 12,000 loaves of bread a day, as shown in figure 3.1, the reservation price for the buyer of the 12,000 loaves must be 3 naira. By similar reasoning, when the quantity sold is 16,000 loaves per day, the marginal buyer's reservation price is 2 naira. Supply curve. Supply curve is a graph showing the quantity of a good that sellers wish to sell at a given price. In the market for bread, the supply curve is a simple schedule or graph that tells us the quantity of bread that a supplier is willing to supply at every price level. For each possible price, the total number of loaves that all bread sellers will be willing to sell at that price. Just as buyers differ with respect to the amount they are willing to pay for bread, sellers also differ with respect to their opportunity cost of supplying bread. For those with limited education and work experience, the opportunity cost of selling bread is relatively low because such individuals typically do not have a lot of high-paying alternatives. For others, the opportunity cost of selling bread is of moderate value. and for others, it is prohibitively high. The supply curve of bread will be upward sloping with respect to price. For example, figure 3.2 below shows a hypothetical supply curve for bread in a given market on a given day. The fact that the supply curve slopes upward may be seen as a consequence of the low-hanging fruit principle discussed in the preceding study session. This principle tells us that as we expand the production of bread, we turn first to those whose opportunity cost of producing bread are lowest, and only then to others with highest opportunity cost. Like the demand curve, the supply curve can be interpreted either horizontally or vertically. Under the horizontal interpretation, we'll begin with a price and then go over to the supply curve to read the quantity that sellers wish to sell at that price on the horizontal axis. For instance, at a price of 2 naira per load, sellers in figure 4 wish to sell 8,000 loaves per day. Under the vertical interpretation, we begin with a quantity and then go up to the supply to read the corresponding marginal cost on the vertical axis. Thus, if sellers in figure 3.2 are currently supplying 12,000 loaves per day, the opportunity cost of the marginal seller is 3 naira per loaf of bread. Thus, the seller's reservation price of selling an additional unit of a good is a marginal cost of producing that good. It is the smallest naira amount for which she would not be financially worse off if she sold an additional unit. In other words, the seller's reservation price is the smallest naira amount for which a seller will be willing to sell an additional unit, which is generally equal to the marginal cost. Market equilibrium. A market is said to be at equilibrium when no actor in the market has any reason to change its behavior so that there is no tendency for production or prices in the market to change. The price at which a good will be sold and bought is known as the equilibrium price, while the quantity that will be sold and bought at the price is the equilibrium quantity. It is the supply and demand curves that serve as a basic tool for finding equilibrium in the market. Figure 3.3a shows supply and demand curves that intercept at point E, and at this point, the quantity demanded is 12, while the price is 3 naira. Thus, point E is the equilibrium point. At price 3 naira, both the buyers and sellers are satisfied because at this price, buyers are buying exactly what they intend to buy, and sellers are selling exactly the quantity they wish to sell. Note that the satisfaction of both buyers and sellers at market equilibrium is in limited sense, because this does not preclude the fact that sellers do not prefer higher prices than the equilibrium price, but they were able to sell all they wish to sell at that price. Similarly, it does not imply that buyers will not prefer lower prices than the equilibrium price, but they could buy exactly as many units of the good as they wish. Thus, if the equilibrium price should change, buyers and sellers would be frustrated. For example, if the equilibrium price should rise to 4 naira, buyers would demand 8 quantities, but sellers will supply 16 amount of the good as indicated in figure 3.3b. At the price of 4 naira, there is excess supply of 8 quantities of the product, which makes the seller to be frustrated. Conversely, suppose the equilibrium price is reduced to 2 naira. The buyers are ready to buy 16 quantity of the good, but the sellers supply only 8 quantity to the market. In this case, the buyers are frustrated since they cannot force the sellers to supply against their wish. This led to an excess demand of 8 quantities of the good. However, when there is excess supply, the sellers have the option of cutting the price, which will stimulate demand upward until it gets back to equilibrium position. Also, given the excess demand, the buyers can decide to offer better price by offering to pay more, which will motivate sellers to supply more until supply gets back to the equilibrium price. Thus, it is at the equilibrium point that both the buyers and sellers are satisfied. Changes in prices and quantities. Let us distinguish between the meaning of the seemingly similar expressions of change in quantity demanded and change in demand. Change in quantity demanded means change in the quantity that people are willing to buy, that is, due to change in price. For instance, figure 3.48 depicts changes in the quantity demanded that are due to changes in the price of the good. When the price falls from 5 naira to 4 naira, the quantity demanded rises from 2 to 4. In contrast, change in demand is a situation where there is a shift of the entire demand curve as shown in figure 3.4b, which depicts an increase in demand that at every price the quantity demanded is higher than before. Thus, a change in quantity demanded refers to movement along the same demand curve, while a change in demand is a shift of the demand curve. Similar analogy can be given to the supply side of the market. A change in supply indicates a shift in the entire supply curve, whereas a change in quantity supplied shows a movement along the supply curve. Factors that determine change in demand. Number 1, change in relative prices. An increase or decrease in relative prices will either shift the demand curve upward or downward, that is, outwardly or inwardly. This shift in the demand curve will depend on the type of good that is involved. In the case of complementary goods, these are goods that are jointly consumed, e.g. bread and butter. An increase in the price of one of the goods will shift the demand curve of the other to the left or inwardly. Thus, when the price of a complement falls, demand shifts rightward, causing equilibrium price and quantity to rise. For example, figure 3.5a shows that a fall in the price of a car will increase the quantity demanded of fuel, given that car and fuel are complementary goods. However, if the goods are substitute, an increase in the price of good A will lead to an increase in quantity demanded of good B. For instance, if the price of rice rises, there will be increase in the quantity demanded of the substitute, savings. In figure 3.5b, as the price of good A increases from P0 to P1, the demand for good B increases from Q0 to Q1, and this shifts the demand curve outward from D0 to D1. 2. income. The income level shifts the demand curve either to the right or left. An increase in the general income level in the country will shift the demand curve to the right, while reduction in the general income level will shift the demand curve to the left. Population. Another factor that can shift the demand curve is the total population in a country, which influences effective demand. An increase in the population will shift the demand curve rightward, since there are more people to demand a good than it was before. Conversely, a reduction in the population will reduce the number of people that will buy a good, which will shift the demand curve leftward. 4. Taste and fashion. Taste is another factor that shifts the demand curve. A positive or favorable taste for a good increases the demand for the good, which thereby shifts the demand curve rightward, while unfavorable taste for a good would decrease the demand and thereby shift the demand curve leftward. For instance, Nigerians are known to buy more of Nokia phones. If there is a change in taste of Nigerians in favor of Samsung phones, what this means is that the demand curve for Samsung phones will shift rightward and vice versa. Fashion of the people can also shift the demand curve. For instance, if fashion favors a good, there will be a rightward shift of the demand curve of the good. Otherwise, there will be a reduction in demand for the good, which will shift the demand curve leftward. For instance, Nigerians used to prefer baggy trousers, but due to change in fashion of the people, Nigerians now prefer straight trousers, which shift the demand curve for baggy trousers leftward and that of straight trousers rightward. Taxation. Taxes are imposed on people by the government in order to raise revenue. A tax is a periodical deduction from people's income that is made mandatory by the government laws. An increase in taxes will reduce their income and make them to have less to spend on consumption. This little income will reduce the consumption of goods and services of the people and thereby shift the demand curve of the goods consumed leftward. However, a reduction in taxes increases the amount available for consumption expenditure, which will lead to shift of the demand curve rightward. Summary. In this study session, you have learned how market allocates goods and services. You also explore how market equilibrium is determined. Lastly, we discuss the differences between changes in demand and changes in quantity demanded. This is the end of study session 3. Thanks for listening.